An abandoned baby.
A cover-up.
A journey from slavery to freedom.
This is the story of Moses, a leader who experiences deep pain and hardship, but still embraces God's sovereign plan for his life.
Like Moses, when God plans the details of our lives, we are offered a choice between fear and faith.
We can make excuses or we can make a difference.
If God is fighting for us, what could stand in our way?
Right, good morning, Oasis Church, 10 o'clock service. Thanks for waving at me. I appreciated that. So I'm Pastor Paul, one of the pastors on the preaching team here. And a couple weeks ago, Bill came to me and said, do you want to do the second series, the series of the making of Moses? And I said, sure. And Bill has taken a much-deserved week off here. What he's doing and working really hard. He did a great job on the Ephesians series. And what we're doing here, we're talking about the making of Moses, and we're using that as an illustration of really the making of us, how God has plans, how God uses us and he uses people to fulfill those plans. And each of us are a part of that, whether they're big plans or whether they're little plans. And last week, Bill talked about pass-through accounts as banking, money coming in, money coming out. And I view it more as a water bottle. You know, we're these empty vessels. And when we accept Christ, God pours into us, and he pours into us through his word, he pours into us through the Holy Spirit, he pours into us through our circumstances, and sometimes those are very difficult circumstances. And he prepares us, and he fills us up. But the point is, we're not supposed to be filled up and capped and set on a shelf. We're called to be used, and we're called to be filled up and then to be poured out, and filled up again and be poured out. And if someone pours into your life and uses you in the circumstances that grow you up, you turn around and use those circumstances and pour out into someone else's life. We have all these plans that are there, and God uses a people, and he uses our circumstances, and sometimes very difficult circumstances, as we're going to see in Moses here, and we saw last week. And they shape us, and they get us ready to be used by God, because whether it's big like Moses or whether it's really small, God has a plan, and he's going to call us. He's going to call us to be used by him for his purposes. So this week we're going to look at the call, and Moses' call. And what I want you to do, as I go through this, I want you to put yourself in Moses' shoes. Try and get into his head, and I'm going to try and shape it so you can see some of the insights and maybe what he was thinking and how God had to shift some of that thinking. And sometimes God has to shift some of our thinking. So as we get in here, think about getting into Moses' head and how God used that. And at the same time, think about yourself. Think about circumstances that you've been in. Think about reasons why maybe when God calls, do you hear his call? Do you respond to his call? Do you respond like Moses did? Do we essentially go through and do that? So I want to go through and talk that. And so just be thinking about that. Get yourself in the mind of Moses and think about how God is using you in your life and calling and preparing you for his life. And the other thing else I want to think about, go back a little bit about God's plans. Because God had plans that are long, long in the making. And actually, the actual physical exodus from Egypt, that when Moses led out, it was 800 years before that God made this prophecy, that he was going to pull these people out. And Moses was the fulfillment of that prophecy. And so if you remember in Genesis, it was Abraham, and he wasn't even Abraham yet, he was Abram. God says, I'm going to make you a great nation. And from you, this great nation is going to be born, and all the world's going to be blessed. So time goes by, there's no kid. He goes, okay, come on, God. Well, maybe it's going to be my servant. God says, no. It's going to be from you. And so this time's going by, and Moses is going, okay, I don't know about this. And so God pulls Moses out, and he looks at the stars. And he says, look at all the stars. You can't even count them. So shall your children be. They're going to be multiplied. And here's the thing that's happened. It said, and Moses believed, and he was reckoned as righteous. One of the first things for us to be used by God is to believe. Is to believe and put our faith in Jesus Christ, to believe that we've been redeemed and restored by Christ so we can use. So Moses made that Abraham made that first step. He believed and he was reckoned as righteous. But then God makes this prediction. And this is in Genesis 15. And he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And the nation whom they serve I will judge, and afterwards they'll come out with great possessions. Now remember that, because when we get into Exodus, you're going to flash back to this prediction 800 years earlier in Genesis 15. So last week Bill talked about Joseph. He came down. God used the circumstances to prepare the way. So when there was a famine, Jacob came down, and they had a refuge during this famine season. And so Joseph and the Pharaoh were buds, and he said, hey, here's my family. Can they come down and stay? 70, 75 people, yeah. What's the worry? What's the problem? And well, the problem is time, and the years changed, things passed. So to go ahead and recap, back in Genesis 1, it says, and these were all the descendants of Jacob, were 70 persons. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now, sometimes when you read the Bible, it's really easy to skip over verses and realize a great length of time has occurred. And if you think that they're supposed to be in Israel for 400 years, and we know from Stephen's talk in Acts 7 that Moses was 40 years old, before he went into the desert, another 40 years. So 80 years, so about 320 years have passed between when Joseph came down and now, and they've multiplied. They've multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And to put it in our terms, think back, so when our nation was founded in 1776, and it's 2024, so that's about 250 years. So this is about 320. So you have to go back to the year 1700, more or less. That's the time difference between when Joseph came down and when Moses was born. And that's a long time. And think back to your great-great-great-great-grandfather, and who would remember Joseph, and who would remember all that? So there's a great span of time. And they multiplied, and they grew and grew. And it says later on in Exodus that they multiplied so much that the Pharaoh was concerned about them. Well, he was concerned because there were so many. And it says in Exodus that they were concerned that they could align with a foreign power, or they could cause an uprising. So they became a national threat, a security threat. So what did he do? He enslaves them. He gets over them and takes away all their power and enslaves them. And you know the story, they were enslaved, and they still multiplied. So he tries to kill all the baby and all that. And then last week, Bill talked about how Moses was born, and the Pharaoh's daughter came and rescued him. And so he was raised as an Egyptian. So this is where I want you to think and put yourself in Moses' head. So the first 40 years of his life, he's raised as a prince. He's raised with someone with royalty. He's raised with someone who's going to command someday. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, wrote that Moses was heir to the throne of Egypt, and while a young man, he led the armies of Egypt in victorious battles against the Ethiopian. So he was skilled in military aspects. And then in Luke 7, as Stephen's talking about Moses, he says, and he, Moses, was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. So I want you to get into his head. He's someone who's command authority when you're trained to lead and you expect people to follow you. And he was going around, here comes the prince, bow down everybody. He says go, go, he says come, come. So he's this guy, he's learned. He's been in the military. He's had some victories. He's coming along, and what was his demeanor like? Well, just in everyday life, you can see when you meet someone, they're confident. They look you in the eye, and how you doing? My name's Pastor Paul. Are you confident? Versus someone who's not confident. And you can just tell that they aren't confident. And just the difference between a slave, they look down, they don't look. But someone who's leading, who's empowered, he's got this air about him. And sometimes in your power, you have this confidence that really borders on arrogance. Because I'm used to leading. I'm used to power. So as I was reading some of these commentaries, they're trying to say, get this in Moses' head. If he was raised this way for 40 years. So this is how he's going to be. This is how he's thinking. But Moses knew that he was a Hebrew. And whether it was from his mom or whether God was starting to work on his heart, he started thinking about the Hebrew people. And he saw the Egyptian, we heard about it last week, mistreating a Hebrew slave. So he comes in, kills him, hides him, okay? And the next day, he's out talking, and he sees two Hebrews, and they're fighting. So he's the guy, he's the savior. He says, hey, you guys don't do that. You shouldn't be doing that. And what did they do? They rejected him. They rejected him and his leadership. They said, who are you to be judge over us? And think about that. What was Moses thinking? What was he thinking he was going to do? You know, here he was raised as this prince. We have a little bit of hint of it in Acts 7. Stephen's going on his discourse there. And Luke writes, and in Acts 7 he says, he, Moses, supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand. But they did not understand. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand. So it's all assumptions. But was he thinking, this is what I was trained for? This is what God put me here for? You know, Bill last week called him a sheepdog, that I'm going to go out and protect my people, and this is how I'm going to do it. God's put me in here for this purpose, and I'm going to be raised up, and I'm going to free all the Hebrew nation, and I'm going to do that. He thought he was ready for these great things, but he wasn't. In God's eyes, he wasn't ready. And why do you think that was? Because it would have been all about Moses. Moses would have been the great conqueror. Moses would have been the great hero. And it wouldn't have been about God. And it's really, really important that all we do, and God can give you great gifts. He can give you great skills. And he wants you to use those skills. He wants you to use those gifts. But he wants us to be humble. Some time ago, it was 20 years go by, maybe it was 30 years, I don't know. A guy named Rick Warren, pastor of a big church, wrote a book called The Purpose-Driven Life. And it talks about being used by God. And you open up the book, and the first line is, it's not about you. It's not. We think too much it's about us. And it's about God. And he wants us to do that. So, he's rejected. They didn't rise up. And further, Bill talked about last week, the killing was known. So the Pharaoh wants to kill him. You think, well, why does he want to kill him? Well, think about that. So you got 2 million people here. They're already afraid of him. You got a guy who's trained in military. He's a good leader. What did Pharaoh think? That he was a traitor? That he was going to turn down the Hebrews and lead them up? So he wants to kill him. I can get that. So what does Moses do? He does a smart thing and he gets out of Dodge. All right? He knows, he flees. And so whatever hopes, if you're assuming that he had some of these hopes, if you're assuming that he had some of these thoughts, that I was raised for this purpose, I was going to bring the Israelites out, just completely dashed, completely gone. And he goes out into the desert. And just the change in his mindset, put yourself in his shoes. He goes from hero to zero, from prince to pauper. He goes from being a big shot to a nobody. And it was this complete change in life circumstances. And so think about some of the life circumstances that you've had changes, maybe not as drastic as that, but your life changes and it can turn on a dime. You go to the doctor and you hear the big C word. Okay, you got cancer, oh no, and your life changes. Your wife, your husband leaves you. Job change. There's people up in North Carolina. Life has radically changed. You know, and it happens sometimes. And there's a saying that says, you can't often control what happens to you. All you can do is control how you react to it. You can't often control what happens to you. All you can do is how you react to it. And I was trying to think of an example, and there was a guy at our old church, a great guy. He's in his 50s now probably, and he's a paraplegic. He's in a wheelchair. He's a really, really great guy. But you listen to his story when he was young. So he was energetic, you know, he liked to do stuff, and he was athletic, and he was aggressive, and he was assertive, and he just loved life and all of that. He was going too fast, got in a car accident, and when he woke up, paraplegic, couldn't move. And just hearing his stories, he said, I was so depressed and so despondent because it wasn't how I thought my life was going to be. And I had to figure things out. And I had to figure out a new normal for my life. Because I was going this way, and all of a sudden, it's going this way. And that happens to us, doesn't it? Sometimes it happens to us. And in Moses' case, it was God's plan. In this case, he became a lawyer. And he was a great guy, but we have these shifts, and we have to figure out, you know, how do we do the circumstances that are within us? So Moses goes in there, gets married, has 2 kids, and he's out in the desert, and he's living this hard life. And my guess is whatever thoughts he had of grandeur, whatever thoughts he had, that I was trained for this, going back to Egypt, over the years, just completely gone away. God was preparing him physically. It's a hard life out in the desert. And so it made him tough. He learned how to live. He learned how to navigate in the desert. God's going to use that maybe in the future there, Moses didn't know that. So he's going through and he's living this new life, and it's been 40 years. 40 years, and he's just out there living this life. He's adjusted to this new normal. Probably the thoughts of going out and rescuing Egypt, the farthest thing from his mind. And now he's ready. Now God's going to come tapping him on the shoulder. Now God says, now I'm going to use you. Why? Because it's going to be all about God and not all about Moses. So we're coming into chapter 3. So Moses is out there in the desert. He's doing what he normally does. He's herding sheep, and he's out there. And God's going to get his attention. He's going to come tap him on the shoulder. So Exodus 3, verse 1 says, Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert, came to Horeb, the mountain of God, which I read later was the mountain of Mount Sinai. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flame of fire from the midst of the bush. So he, Moses, looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight. Why does the bush not burn? And if you've been here a while and you've heard me share a little bit of my story, I was a natural resource major. I wasn't going to be a preacher. I was going to do a lot of stuff that I ended up doing, and I was going to be out in the woods. And so I studied different habitats and different things, and plants always adapt to their different habitats. So out in the desert, you either have a big taproot where the water can get real deep. Maybe there's fleshy like cactus. They retain the water. And sometimes the bushes have really thick resin in them to protect them. Think of creosote. Okay, think of yerba santa. Think of palo verde if you've been out in the desert. And when it burns really bright, and it burns really hot, but it also burns really, really fast. And Moses would have known that. So he looks out there and goes, wow, something's happening over here. God's getting his attention. Here's this bush, it's not being consumed. So God's getting his attention. So when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, okay, so now he's got his attention, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Well, there's three things to take away from that section there. He goes, Moses, Moses. And whenever God uses your name twice, he's trying to get your attention. And it's either out of urgency or it's out of intimacy. Think of Abraham in Genesis, who's got Isaac laid out, and God told him to sacrifice his old son. There's no sacrifice. He's there, and he's ready to plunge the knife into his only son's heart. And God goes, Abraham, Abraham, don't do that. Don't sacrifice your son. And there's a sheep over there. So there's the urgency. And you can figure when Jesus, when he's talking here, and here's Mary looking adoringly at Jesus and all that. Martha's running around doing what Martha does, and she's getting everything all ready and stuff. And she's ticked. She goes, how come Mary's not helping? She goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, help me here. She needs to help out. And you can imagine Jesus putting his arm around and going, Martha, Martha. Just that intimacy. So when God calls, and he uses that double names, he's getting his attention. The other thing he did, he establishes that he's holy. God establishes that he's holy. He said, don't come closer. Take your shoes off. Take your sandals off. You're on holy ground. We need to understand that God is holy and we are not. We have this magnificent, magnificent God. And sometimes it's hard to understand just the difference between us and the holiness of God and who he is. So we need to be, in one sense, awe, not in a fearful awe, but just in awe of God and his holiness and the magnificence. So God gets his attention, calls his name, establishes God's holy. I'm God. I'm this God of all your ancestors. And then an interesting thing happens. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Sometimes in the Bible, when people see who God is, and they see his holiness, it brings with absolute clarity that God's holy and we are not. We know that we fall short. And when we see the moral purity of God against ourselves, it's just stark difference. And in the Bible, when Isaiah sees God in Isaiah 6:5, he says, woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips. He notices that difference. Peter, when he realizes Jesus is God, in Luke 5, he says, when he realizes Jesus is God, he says, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. So we need to understand God is holy and we are not. Yet God loves us. He makes a plan for us to redeem to him, and God can use us as he's about to use Moses. So he's got his attention, so now he's going to give him the assignment. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrow, so I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians. Go now, therefore, and I will send you to the Pharaoh, that you may bring my people to the children of Israel out of Egypt. So that's his assignment. What an assignment. I'm having you come fulfill this prophecy that was made 800 years ago. What a task. In one sense, what an honor for God to be chosen like this, for God to choose him like this. Pretty big honor. So what's Moses' reaction? This is what I want you to hear and see. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he, God, said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Moses' response, who am I? What a change in demeanor. Who am I that you would use me? Who am I that you would send me? I'm a nobody. I've been out in this desert for 40 years. Who am I? And you look at God's response. First you go back 40 years. And so if he was the prince and he was there and he was thinking, I'm going to be the Redeemer, if God had tapped him on the shoulder 40 years earlier, what a response going to be? Roger that, God, got it. Roll up our sleeves, let's get going. This is why I was trained. Okay? That's not what God wanted. He wanted, who am I? He wanted, I don't know, God. Who am I? I am just a nobody. Because we have to rely sometimes on God when it's only God and not ourselves, that God gives the glory and not ourselves. And like I said, each of you are gifted. God's given you some great gifts. And when you want to use those gifts. But the thing is to be humble. A lot of pastors fall when they fall and they get big churches because it's all about him. They get the big head, all that. They get all the adoration and all this kind of stuff. And they forget that it's all about God. And he wants humility. In the Bible, God is chastising Israel for not following. And this is in Micah. And they say, what do you want? What will it please me? What about all these sacrifices? What about rivers of oil? What about 10,000 bulls? So I sacrifice, my firstborn son. This is in Micah 6:8. And here's what God says. He says, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. We're called to live uprightly. We're called to do justice. We're called to be kind. But we're called to be humble. And I've known some very good, big people who were very, very humble. One of the ones I'm thinking about, he was executive vice president of ARCO, big oil company. Been all around the world, been in China, been on Washington and all that kind of stuff. And he was on our board for this camp that I ran, this program that I ran. He was the most humblest guy. And we would go out to lunch, and we go to this restaurant, and here's the valet, and he goes, Jose, how you doing? How's your family? Remember me to your wife. Just a humble guy. We're called to be humble in all that we do. And then God said, but here's what God didn't say. Here's Moses saying, who am I? He didn't say, Moses, you're the guy. I'm going to pump you up. You got all this stuff. You got all this ability. Look how you've been trained. You can do all this. Did God do that? No. God said, I will be with you. I will be with you. And that should be, in a normal circumstances, sufficient. It should be like a breath of fresh air. God will be with us. God will be with me as I take this task, relying on God. And yet we don't. It isn't enough because we have our fears, we have our self-doubts, we have our insecurities, and it's hard for us to let go on that. It's easy to say, God will be with us, that'll be enough. And yet each of us, when we've stepped out, sometimes it's scary. And he even says, God will be with you. I don't know, because I'm a human being, and I have fears. I have my insecurities, and I know what they are, and I've been insecure a lot, So here's Moses saying, he didn't even know there's God. He said, I will be with you. It's not enough. So Moses now starts negotiating with God, and he's starting to get excuses why not to go. So he says, Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am sent me to you. The big I am statement. God is. Never had a beginning, never had an existence. He's existent, unchanging. He's transcendent. He doesn't need anything from us. He is, outside of time, outside of space, this magnificent God. I am who I am. God is this magnificent, magnificent God. And he relies on nothing for his existence. And yet he chooses to interact with us. He's both transcendent and he's both immanent. He enters into our life. And there's times, this is kind of a segue, a lot of times people will say when you're talking to them, well, Jesus never claimed, he never said explicitly that I am God. Well, actually he did, but he did it in the language of that time. And he did it in several different ways, but one of the ones that I want to point out, so in John 8, he's talking to the Pharisees and he's having this dialogue like he always has, the dialogue back and forth. He's trying to dialogue with the Pharisees. And in the end of John 8, he says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he was glad. So this is Jesus talking to the Pharisees. Abraham, a long time ago. And they say, you're not 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham? They couldn't comprehend that. Here's what Jesus says. He says, before Abraham was born, I am. The Pharisees knew exactly what he was referring to. That's why they picked up stones to stone him. He was claiming to be God. So remember that big I am statement that comes up from here. So then, God's laying out his plan. So he's called him, given an assignment. Now he's going to lay out the details of the plan. But I am sure the king of Egypt will not let you go, not even by my mighty hand. I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and that shall be, when you go, you shall not go empty-handed. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor, namely of her who dwells near her house, articles of silver, articles of gold, articles of clothing. And you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. Where did that come from? Back fulfillment of Genesis 15. God's fulfilling that. So you think that would be sufficient. So put yourself in Joseph's shoes, okay? So he's out in the desert, he's got his sheep, he's barefoot, standing away, there's this flaming bush that isn't being consumed, this voice is coming out, telling him he's got all this stuff. Whew. You think that would be sufficient? But God goes, I don't know. So he starts making excuses. He starts going, I just don't know. I gotta, I just don't know. But picture this. He's out there. And so he said, we all make excuses. And so think of the excuses you make when God is calling you. When you're feeling this tap on your shoulder and you're going, I don't know, God. What excuses do you make? Well, these are the excuses that he makes. Then Moses answered and said, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say the Lord has not appeared to you. Well, in one way, I get that. Everyone that he's been around is gone. Who's he? He's a nobody coming in from the desert. And he says, I'm from God. Why should they believe me? Okay, that's kind of a reasonable request. So then the Lord said to him, what's that in your hand? And he said, a rod. And he said, cast it on the ground. So he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. The Lord said to Moses, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. And he reached out his hand and caught it. And it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, reminding who he is, has appeared to you. So there's the first miracle. Okay, that's pretty wild, pretty good. Furthermore, the Lord said to him, now put your hand in your bosom. And he put his hand in his bosom. When he took it out, behold, the hand was leprous like snow. And he said, put your hand back in your bosom again. So he put his hand in his bosom again, and behold, it was restored. So there's another second miracle. And then it will be, if they do not believe you, nor heed the message of the first sign, that they may believe the message of the latter sign, it shall be, if they do not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, you shall take water from the river and pour it on the dry land, and the water which you take from the river will become blood. So God shows them 3 miraculous signs. So he's here in the desert, barefoot, burning bush. His voice is coming out of him, pretty wild. Sees these 2 miracles. You think again that would be enough. But Moses doesn't have any confidence. Moses still is just going, I just don't want to do this, God. And he says, well, I can't speak good. He said, well, your brother Aaron, we're going to get him. We'll him to speak for you. And even after all that, Moses finally says, thanks for the offer, but I'm going to have to say no. He refuses God. Can you imagine that? You're sitting there saying, yeah, I don't think so. So God gets angry at him. Then Moses reluctantly says, okay, I'm going to do it. And then to comfort him even more, he says, and the Lord said to Moses in meeting, go return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. So if any of the fears, he's kind of removing excuses. I've been in management for a long time, and one of the things about management is be the excuse taker-awayer. Okay, so he's taking away excuses for Moses, and even if one of his excuses was, these guys wanted to kill you, I'm a murderer, if I go back, they're going to get me. He goes, nah, they're all dead. You're good to go. Trust me. And that's what he's trying to get God to do, is to trust him. So he goes through, and then he gives a reminder, some little more details of the plan. Here's what's going to happen when you go back. I'm telling you all these details so you'll know ahead of time. Then Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey and returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God. And notice it was the rod of Moses. Now it's the rod of God. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all of these wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. But I will harden his heart, so he will not let his people go. So he's telling Moses, this is what's going to happen. It's going to be a tough go. Push a rock uphill. It's tough sledding. Pharaoh's going to resist. He's telling them that. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed I will kill your son, your firstborn. So he's telling Moses the end game, and that's exactly what happens. You have all the plagues. He refuses, and he says, yeah, I'll let you go. Nope, just kidding. Not going to let you go. And it gets worse and worse and worse and worse until finally the Passover, and God does kill the firstborn of everyone of Egypt. So Moses meets Aaron, his brother, and they go to Egypt. And they meet with the elders, because the elders have to be convinced first. The elders have to say, who's this guy? Haven't seen him. Maybe some people remember him. Maybe some people don't. And then Moses went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. Then he did the signs on the side of the people. So the people believed, because it's really important if you're going to lead these people that they believe. And they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel. And he looked on their affliction, and they had bowed their heads and worshiped. So now the great showdown begins. If you keep on reading, like I just said, you had all the plagues and all that, and finally they let them go. But this isn't a study about the Exodus, and this isn't a study even necessarily about Moses. Moses is the example. It's about the making of Moses, and that God had a plan for his life. And God has plans within plans within plans within plans. Because think about this. God told Abraham 800 years before, here's my plan. And then he uses Moses. So he uses Moses, that was part of a plan, okay, for Moses' life, that was part of a plan to bring the Hebrew nation out, okay, to establish the nation and create the nation of Israel. And that in itself was part of a larger plan, okay, to eventually set the stage for the coming of the Messiah, which is actually part of a larger plan for God's redemption of all of mankind. So it was a plan within a plan with a plan, and sometimes we don't know how we fit into all those plans. And sometimes we don't see how we factor into God's plans, and yet we do. And probably none of us here are going to be called to do something as grand and as grandiose as Moses there. But each of us, God's going to use, because God uses people. Doesn't have to, but he chooses to use people to execute his plans. And so, he prepares us. Moses was reluctant to accept God's plans. And I get that. There's times when I feel God's tapping me on the shoulder, and I'm reluctant. Fear, yeah, I got fears. Lack of confidence, absolutely. Maybe we're too comfortable. We don't want to get out of our comfort zone. But God calls us, and look how God uses Moses, and he uses hard circumstances to shape him, to get his mental mindset right, to get him physically fit. And sometimes we don't understand the circumstances that God has us in. And we go, why, God? Maybe God's got a plan. And just like my friend here in the wheelchair, we can't often control what happens to us. The only thing we can do is control how we react. And so God was preparing Moses. And some of you in your life, you're being prepared right now for God to be used. And it's not necessarily in big ways. I know for me, we're often called to be used in little different ways, and sometimes big ways, but more often than not, it's just little ways. And I was thinking of a couple of examples. One, there was a guy who had just a really radical life change, just really tore his life apart. And I had met with him, had coffee with him, and so saw him. I said, I'm going to go talk to him. Just something told me I need to go talk to him. So I spent about 5 minutes, 6 minutes with him, just really asked him how he was doing. Didn't think too much about it. And yet later on, he called me up that night, and he said, that's exactly what I needed. I was feeling so down. I need to know that someone cared. And when you do those little things, people that just maybe only God sees, it brings God joy. And it touches people's hearts. It's the touch, it's the call, it's the remembering. It's those little things that God can use to shape a person's life, to be poured into, and you're part of that plan. And there's other times we resist the call. I was thinking of a time when, again, a small example, when I resisted the call. So my little 4-year-old is in karate, and it's so fun to watch him in the dojo, and you got all these little 4-year-olds running around. And the sensei is so good, he'll get their attention. Body focus, eye focus. And the kids are like this. It's really fun to watch. And outside there's a pond, and there's fish and turtles in it, so I bought some dried crickets and dried earthworms, and we go out and we feed the fish. And I was out there once, and there was this guy on this bench. And I didn't know if he was homeless. He didn't have really good clothes on. But some said, I just need to go talk to this guy. So I just barely started to talk to them when they got out of their karate class and pulled me away and all that, but I really felt I should go talk to him. So we fed the fish, and it was time to go, and I usually walk him to the car, but I really felt drawn that I need to go back to this guy. And I was with Debbie, my wife, and we got in the car, and I almost turned around and said, no, I got to go back. But we went home, but something that was just on my mind, I felt this call. And I even drove back there. He's gone. I haven't seen him since. But I really felt that I missed an opportunity. And sometimes it haunts me when God will tap us on the shoulder, and for whatever reason, whether big or small, that we just go, I don't know, God. Are you going to use me? God uses us in many different ways. And sometimes we try and bargain with God. Have you guys ever tried to bargain with God? I have. When I was coming back into my faith, so I was saved when I was little and drifted when I was in high school and college. When I was coming back in, I said, okay, God, I'm going to surrender, because that's what it takes. It takes to surrender. God, however you want to use me, I surrender. I'm going to do whatever you want me to do. So I was at that point of surrendering to God, and I said, but don't send me to the inner city. I'm just not a city guy. I like the outdoors. So that's what I was saying. So I'm going to surrender, but don't send me to the inner city. Maybe you guys have done that. So I worked for the Forest Service for a while, worked for a city for a while, and then guess what? I spent 15 years working with at-risk inner city kids. God has a sense of humor, but you know what? Some of those were the most rewarding times of my life. And God blessed me because I was still able to go to the mountains, and we had a camp program. I was able to live in a suburb outside, but I went into some really not very nice parts of East LA, Central LA, and areas like that. But that's what I did. And so we surrender. We need to be willing to do that. Sometimes our past sins hinder us, don't they? We've all sinned. We all have things that we're ashamed of. We all have things that we look back and go, oh, how can God use me? How can he do that? Well, that's the big lie. That Satan gets in there, and he just says, no, God's not going to use you. And you got to be aware of that. Satan's saying, no, you're not good enough. You can't be used by God. God uses ordinary people, and we need to understand that. He overcomes all of that. And, we see our weaknesses. We see the areas where we fall short. But God sees our strengths and how he can use us. He sees the gifts that he's given you. And so as we start to wrap this up, there's a couple of things that I want to end with. And part of those things is God often uses ordinary people to do what seems like ordinary things for his glory. All of us can be tapped on the shoulder and be used by God. Not necessarily as big as with Moses, but it is. It's the little things. It's the little things that just, in God's plan and how he plans to use people, we don't think they're big things. And sometimes we won't know this side of heaven how we've impacted a person's life. But we will. It's the little things that bring God joy, that people see God in you. That they need that touch, they need that call, they need that care. And so we need to be open to how God would use us. Really, really important because all of us have that opportunity to be used like that. The flip side is God often uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things for his glory. If you go through the Bible, a lot of these people, they aren't any great people. The disciples were knuckleheads, man. When you see what they did, you go, oh my gosh, what? And yet God used them mightily. And so sometimes we're called, and it could be as simple as serving like he was saying in the children's ministry or leading a small group. But sometimes God taps you on the shoulder. We had 3 people up here last week, and Jeremy just felt God calling him to go to the hurricane area. And he called up Samaritan's Purse. He said, I want to volunteer. He was a medic in the military. And the other guy went, Michael Bryan was in the Coast Guard, and another guy went. And so they went. And the first report back is great things have been done, miraculous things. And he's so filled, and I hope he's able to share it later on. But God tapped him on the shoulder. And Jeremy went. And the other people went. They went. And that's the whole thing. It's just stepping out. It's facing our fears. Sometimes we're hesitant. And sometimes we're in the valley. Sometimes we're in the desert like Moses was. And God's preparing us for different things. A lot of times he uses our hardships and difficulties so we can relate to people. Sometimes he needs to take us down a notch because we think we're all that. Hi, God can use me. I goes, yeah, you're not ready yet. I'm going to take you down, get you by the knees and get you ready to use me. But the big thing is it's stepping out. Because here's the deal, is we need to be prepared to serve God. In Ephesians 2:8 says, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself. It's a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. It's not a works-based salvation. I'm teaching a class in the academy. We're going through all these different religions, and they're all works-based. If I do this, if I do this, if I do this, I'm going to earn my salvation. Christianity is no. There's no way when you think the holiness of God and who God is and who we are, we fall short. So we need a Redeemer. And so God has made the way through Jesus Christ to be reconciled to him so that none of us can boast. It's all in God's grace. But, read the second half here. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. We're not saved by works. There's nothing we can do to save us. But God has prepared for us good works that he's created for us beforehand that we should walk in them. And so when we talk about the call from Moses, that was a mighty big example. And you see the differences in Moses' life, how he was trained and how he was this, and God had to take him down to who am I? Who am I that you would use me? Who am I that you would send me? God says, I will be with you. And that's enough. And we have to work past our fears, past our insecurities, because God has gifted us. He's gifted us for works to be used by him. And that's how God works, through his people, through you, through all of you. And so we need to be open to how God uses us in our life. We need to be open to that call, to that tap on the shoulder. And we're not going to lead people out of Egypt, but we can make an impact in someone's life. And we can serve in different areas. And it doesn't need to be at Oasis. We can use you here, church leaders, children's ministry, back in their production line. There's all sorts of places. But it could be a prison ministry. It could be a homeless shelter. It could be a food pantry. God could call you in different ways. It could be with your neighbor. You just need to be sensitive to your neighbor. Your neighbor's having a hard time. How's God going to call you in those ways? Really, really important. I think that's the message that we're trying to get across. That God has a plan and God has a call. And we need to be sensitive to, are we being prepared or are we being called? And when God calls us, will we say yes? We'll reach up and say, God can use me in big ways and in small ways. Father God, just thank you for who you are. Thank you that you use us in so many different ways, and you use other people to pour into us, and use circumstances in our lives to prepare us, Lord, to be called by you. That nothing we can do can earn our salvation, that's just by grace. But Lord, you have prepared for us to be called to be used in so many different ways. Helps each of us here to know when you're tapping us on the shoulder, whether big or small ways, Lord, that you will continue to use us for your glory and your plans. And we give all the glory to you, and we thank you. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Thanks for coming, everybody. If you need a prayer, there's prayer in the back. Please go do that. But we're certainly glad that you're here.